Hi, this is Vivian Vande Velde. Welcome to Festival to Go. This is a picture of me showing the way I looked in January of this year. And now it's November. And after several months of quarantine and semi-quarantine and sheltering in place and social distancing and not being able to go to the hairdresser to get my hair colored, my hair is yet another casualty of COVID. That is not to make light of COVID and the pandemic, because a lot of people have suffered greatly from it, a lot more seriously than not being able to get their hair colored. And that includes all of you, because as students, you have had to learn an entirely different way of learning, with some of you going to school part-time, being at home, having virtual learning. It's been quite an adjustment for you, and I'm sorry that you've had to go through that. I am sorry that I am not able to go to your school to speak to you, but that you need to come to me in my home and watch me virtually as I talk about books and stories and ideas and where they come from. Speaking of social distancing, I saw this sign, which I very much like. Social distancing is boring. Exiled for the good of the realm sounds much more interesting. So, greetings, my fellow exiles. I have a brother who is 1 year older than I am. And when we were kids growing up, he very much liked reading about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. I did not care for King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. It was too many battles, and it was just not something that I was interested in. Here's a picture of a couple of pages from that book, and you can see that the text goes pretty much non-stop, and it is very old-fashioned language, not to my liking at all. But at one point, we were away from home, and he had brought some books, and I had brought some books, and I finished my books, and I wanted something to read. And this was one of the books that my brother had. And I said, "Oh, the Once and Future King. That sounds interesting. What does that mean?" And he explained it was a story about King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. And he said that the title was referring to the fact that Merlin, the sorcerer, makes a prediction that Arthur will come back at a time of England's greatest need. And I was still not interested, but there was nothing else to read. And so I started reading this book. I ended up loving the story, as did a lot of other people. You can see this is a picture from a poster of Walt Disney's movie, The Sword and the Stone, a cartoon that was made based on the book. You can see that at the bottom it says story by Bill Peet, but based on the book by T.H. White, the same book that I had read. It was also made into a musical, and maybe you've seen it as a play, maybe you have seen the movie version. This is a poster from the movie version, but because there are such wonderful songs, a lot of times it is produced by high school groups. The thing that I found so wonderful about this story was that I loved all of the characters. It is a story about King Arthur and his wife Guinevere and Sir Lancelot, who is the best knight in the realm. And Guinevere loves both Arthur and Lancelot. Arthur gives a very famous speech where he says if he could choose anyone to be his best friend, anyone to be his brother, anyone to be his son, he would always choose Lancelot. And Lancelot very much admires and loves King Arthur. How can this story have a happy ending when what these people want goes against each other? There are also knights who are having feuds with one another. Maybe one knight has killed another knight's father in battle. So the second knight kills the first knight, and the first knight's brothers kill the second knight. And this feud just goes on. And I liked all of the characters. I wanted them to stop fighting, but they didn't trust each other. There was no way that they were going to. So I loved all of these characters, and I wanted them to have happy endings. And it was probably the most grown-up book that I had read up to that point, because I knew going in that it couldn't be a happy ending. So all of these characters were so well defined and so well rounded, except for Sir Mordred. Mordred is King Arthur's illegitimate son. He is a coward. He is an inept knight, and there is nothing good about him. He is the kind of person who says, I love being wicked. Wicked is good. Ugly is beautiful. And I thought, there's nobody like that. Somebody can do wicked things, but he's doing it for a reason, even if that reason is for personal gain or to get back at someone that he doesn't like. And those are not noble pursuits, but it's a reason. It isn't because he can't tell the difference between good and evil or beauty and ugly. So here's a picture of Sir Mordred from the movie where he is being a coward and begging for his life. And in most tellings of the story, Mordred has no redeeming qualities. This is a picture of him from the movie Excalibur, where he is pretty full of himself. Here he is in the movie The Legend of the Sword. You can usually be fairly certain that if someone has glowing red eyes, he is not going to be one of the good guys. And here he is again in one of the stage productions. In the books, he is always described as being basically a totally incompetent knight. You wonder how he ever got to be a knight, because it will say something like that he was at a tournament and his opponent sorely smites him and he topples from his horse and is grievous injured. And I'm thinking, if he's always falling off of his horse, and if he's always being cowardly, and if he's always being treacherous, why is it that by the end of the story, half of the knights of Camelot choose to follow him instead of Arthur? A few more images from books. And another one. And here's this picture, just in case there's any doubt. It is labeled Sir Mordred the Traitor. Here's a comic book version. The text at the bottom says, "The Black Knight helpless, Merlin in a mystic trance, enter Mordred the Evil." So I thought, if Mordred was going to turn half of Camelot against the great King Arthur and caused this epic battle. There must have been more to him than the cowardly, inept, treacherous person that we were hearing about in all of these other stories. He must have had one or two, at least, good adventures. And that was how I came to write the Book of Mordred. I'm going to read to you a small section of it. At the point where we first meet Mordred, and we meet him through a character, Elena, whose house has just been ransacked by some knights and her young daughter taken away. And she goes onto the road to try to get help, and the first knight who passes by her. He refuses to help. He actually thinks that she is a beggar and tosses her a coin. Then she hears someone else coming. The horse was a destrier, a fine, light gray war horse, though the rider, unarmored and without a helmet, looked quite young. Somebody important, then, she thought, or the son of somebody important. So be it. He was going slowly enough for Elena to hope she could stop him without getting herself killed. She waited until he was abreast of her, knowing that the horse was aware of her presence, even if the youth wasn't. At the last possible moment she jumped up and grabbed the reins for one instant, and then leaped back off the road. Immediately the horse, trained for battle, reared up on its hind legs and flailed its front hoofs at the space where Elena had been an instant before. She had counted on the young lord to keep his mount from trampling her, despite his surprise, but he slid out of his saddle and hit the road, rear end first. The horse, fortunately, was satisfied and galloped away. "Sorry," Elena said, running up to the felled rider. Most of all she regretted yet more delay, but she hadn't meant for him to fall, and she hoped he wasn't hurt. "Sorry." He was swearing in some foreign dialect, possibly Gaelic, and trying with only moderate success to get to his feet. Elena let him pull himself up on her arm. "What were you thinking, woman?" he demanded, which she took as a strong indication that he would recover. "I said I was sorry." "Oh, well, that fixes all, then." "Cornish," she settled on, just the faintest hint, or in inflection than pronunciation. "Fine horsemanship," she observed icily. His dark gray eyes widened, then narrowed, and he took a deep breath, but he bit back whatever he was going to say and turned his back on her. Without a word, he started walking. Young, Elena reflected. He was even younger than she had first thought, probably not even her own age, and thin-skinned, apparently. Not the kind of person she'd have chosen, but she didn't have the luxury of choice, and after all, it would have been worse if he'd been the kind to take out his annoyance on her. She hurried to catch up. "I am sorry," she repeated. He kept on walking without bothering to look at her. When he finally spoke, it was to the air before them. "You could have been killed," which was not what she'd expected him to be brooding about. So you can tell from this little introductory section that he is not exactly a great knight, although I have made the excuse for him that he is quite young, and he does get more competent as the story continues, and he does help other people too. For the story, I needed to do a lot of research on castles and on weapons and armor. Again, not what I would have ever guessed when I was growing up watching my brother read what I considered boy books. This is what I looked like in 1981 when I started writing the Book of Mordred. Here's a picture of me typing at a typewriter, not a computer, not a smartphone, but a typewriter. And this is what I looked like in 2005 by the time the book was finally published, because it got rejected a whole bunch of times and it got revised a whole bunch of times. I think a lot of people are surprised to hear that an author, even a professional author who has had multiple books published, does sometimes get rejections. The important thing is to write about something that you're interested in. In this case, I was interested in finding out more or making up more about this character, who seemed to have been maligned in other stories. You need to find out what it is that interests you, because each of you is different from everybody else in the world. No matter where you go in the country or in the world, you're never going to find anybody exactly like you, because we all have different experiences and are formed by our culture and our surroundings and the people around us. So you are unique. No one anywhere else in the world is just like you. And no matter how far back we go in time, no matter how far back we go in time, no matter how far back we go in time, there was never, ever anybody just like you. And even if we go way into the future, there never will be anybody just like you. Even if you're a twin, your twin is different from you. Each of you has your own likes, your own experiences, especially the more you grow older. Maybe you're in different classes. Maybe you have different friends. You'll go to different movies with your friends, or your teacher will give you different books from your twin to read. And those experiences make you be a different person, because each one of us has our own stories to tell, and nobody else in the world, in the past, in the future, will ever be able to tell your story just the way you would. So I want to encourage all of you to remember that if you don't tell your story, whether it is through words or music or dance or illustration, if you don't tell your story, that story is going to be lost to the world. So I want to encourage each of you to share your own story. And there's little bits of you in each of your stories, even though it might be not readily apparent. So you might think, okay, here's a story told about King Arthur and his son Mordred and all these knights, and they lived in the dark ages of England. What could I possibly know about that? Well, I put little bits of myself in the story. Here's another short example. This is after Mordred has brought Elena to Camelot, and Elena and Mordred are going to set off to try to rescue the daughter. The next day, Elena fidgeted in the morning sunlight, which streamed in through the open window. The lady-in-waiting, who was arranging her hair, giggled. Celeste, in the mirror, a real glass one, not just polished metal, Elena could see Queen Guinevere's disapproving look. Celeste giggled again. Guinevere approached and took the hairbrush, then dismissed the servant with a motion of the head. Elena caught Celeste's reflection in the glass, turning back in the doorway for a final look, no doubt relishing the amusement of a lady dressed in boy's clothing, a lady who proclaimed herself ready to take on a man's task. Guinevere moved behind Elena and blocked her view of the door. "Silly girl," she said, but Elena couldn't tell, not for certain, which of them the queen meant. She rearranged Elena's long brown braids into a much less elaborate knot, one which would stay up without needing a good deal of attention. Guinevere's hands were very thin and very white, and had a tendency to tremble with nervous energy when they weren't occupied. But now they worked quickly and deftly. "I do wish you would reconsider," she said softly. "The men are trained for just this sort of thing, you know." "I can ride as well as any man," Elena told her. "I am not going to hold them back. Kira must be so frightened. She needs me. She needs to see me as soon as possible." Her own hands were rough, and she nervously picked at a piece of skin by her thumbnail until, just as she thought, "I must stop before I cause it to bleed," it began to bleed. She held on tight to stop the blood, but also to hide it. Do any of you have a nervous or embarrassing habit? This business about picking at the skin around my nails, that's something that I do. And trying to stop my finger from bleeding, especially when I'm going to be going on stage or talking in front of a group of kids, that's an experience that I've also had. By including something like that, I make the character more believable. And that's something that you can do too. Put little bits of yourself into the stories. So I want to encourage each of you to tell your own story in the way only you can, and not to be afraid to use details from your own life, because that will make your characters more believable and more interesting. This is Vivian Vande Velde, or at least Vivian Vande Velde the way I looked in January, wishing you good health and asking you to be kind.